choose your questions. I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's a question of interpretation, how I interpret the late positivity. So I'm assuming that the late positivity reflects inferential cost, reflects updating cost. So if I see a modulation of the amplitude and a decrease of the processing resources required for this kind of updating and inferencing, then I take from that it's easier for people who have a steep slope, for example, to carry out this updating. And so they are better at adapting to the meaning, and they are better at carrying out inferences. I mean, I don't have independent evidence, So I don't have independent evidence. It's basically based on the ERP signature I observe and the modulation I see in it, that I take it that processing is easier because there's less processing cost that I observe. But I don't have an independent measure of saying that, it's easier for them to interpret and integrate this. Maria.
Thank you. It's very interesting, and I have a question regarding the last part, because you said that this alpha slope is stable, unlike working memory tests, which depend on your performance of the day. But do we know how stable this measure is? So, is it also not dependent on how awake people are, how well rested? Perhaps these values also change depending on situation and time.
There have been long-term studies, for instance, by Klimesh and people who first looked at initial alpha frequency, because the initial alpha frequency also affects, how you process or how you use adjacent frequency bands. So that has an effect on, beta or other processing ranges that you might be interested in. So there's work from the 90s that has looked at this and has shown that this is a very stable effect. So if you have an initial alpha frequency of 10.2, then there's not a lot of variation across time and across situation of testing.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So thanks for the talk. And I was wondering how much, well, the first question would be, when did you start the measures in the ERP studies? What was T0, the pronunciation of the metonymy or the end of the sentence? And then my follow-up question is, do we know how much of the effect could be attributed to syntactics rather than semantics? Does the placement of the metonymy in the sentence change the processing? Because intuitively it seems that there's like a failure of an expectation of a subject being present in the sentence when there's a metonymy. For example, of the cappuccino, we expect like a person to be doing something, but instead we get an object, which doesn't really fit the subject expectation. That's why the question, if moving the metonymy in the sentence changes the ERP signal.
Okay. There were a couple of... So question number one is... let's say, does the syntactic position of the expression have an impact? So there have been studies that said, I first have to encounter a mismatch. So Jackendorf, for instance, says, you have to have a mismatch between syntax and semantics, and then you initiate some kind of process of inference inferencing and extending this work. However, we find examples where there's no mismatch, yeah, where we still engage in extra processing work to arrive at an intended meaning. Yeah, so, well, Stone Lion is also a mismatch between the materials. What's the example? I don't remember right now, but you know, there doesn't have to be a mismatch. But so what we did in the ERP study is that we assured that there was a mismatch on the metonymic expression. That's why we had these complicated sentences where we said, the waitress asked the barkeeper who wanted to pay. The barkeeper said that the cappuccino wanted to pay. And so we hope that given the context, you were already predicting an animate entity. And so that this referential shift was actually happening on the cappuccino, because, you know, if ERPs are time sensitive, we have to measure it here and not encounter a mismatch later on. So, but it doesn't matter whether it occurs in subject or object position, and it doesn't even have to be a mismatch. Yeah? If I'm extending the meaning from, say, the substance to the person, then I do this instantaneously. Yeah? So that's the first question. The other question was probably going in the direction whether people adapt faster later on in the experiment. Is that right?
No, I think you answered. But maybe just to like make it more precise, you started the ERP measurements from the pronunciation of the metonymy or the end of the sentence. What was t equals 0 in the ERP measures?
So the ERP was measured at the metonymic expression and at the control condition for the same participants over a number of instances, you know, 120 uses, metonymic uses compared to 120 control conditions, for instance, in the dating app reports.
So it was immediately after the pronunciation of the cappuccino that you see an effect? Even
it's actually
before
time locked to the onset of the noun. So cappuccino, yeah, and that's what you observe there, that within 1,000 milliseconds, everything has happened. So that happens
that's surprising.
very quickly. Yeah.
Thanks. That answers the question. Thank you.
Yeah. Marcus has.
Great work. It's really interesting and innovative. I think a main point of yours is the conventionalization issue, right? But there seems to be a little ambiguity there. There can be something like, let's call it lexical conventionalization that is targeted to a specific word. And I think the Woodstock case might be such, yeah? So in general, I mean, you can have sort of this kind of place to event, right? But it doesn't work for many places, right? It only works for specific ones. The cappuccino case, I think, is different, right? The cappuccino case is a, let's call it structural convention, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's cappuccino or whether it's Coca-Cola or whether it's a tea or something like that, right? It would work. I mean, if it works for cappuccino, it should work well in that kind of community for all other types of drinks or so, right? So do you see this ambiguity there, and does up somehow in your experiments or in your data? Do you agree that there is this ambiguity between lexical conversation and more this kind of structural conversation?
No, I fully agree. Mm-hmm. I mean, for lexical, I would say, you know, something like champagne or camembert, you know, there we have the beverage and we have the food, and we don't even think about the place that it came from anymore. That is actually the origin of that name. Mm-hmm. And I try to suggest that for these place for event metonymies that happens, yeah, and you need to have a historic event, you need to have some kind of salient event that really makes this use possible, yeah. Mm-hmm. What is different for the cappuccino cases is that there's an ad hoc use, yeah, so this can be an individual act, there's more variation, but there are certain constructions, yeah. So in a restaurant, I use the beverage or the food they ordered. At the hospital, mm-hmm. I use the syndrome they have. Mm-hmm. You know, in the mm-hmm. university context, mm-hmm. I might use the theme of the presentation or the thesis. So there's certain constructions, frames that work really well. Clothing works well, but again, salient features that have some kind of functional relation with the intended referent.
I mean, the background of my question is a little bit like this, that if it's lexical conventionalization, right? And it is sort of in the way of getting established, right? Then this should have an effect on the N400 component, because that is usually associated with lexical retrieval or integration of a lexical item in sentence. Whereas if it's something like structural innovation, right? Like in the cappuccino case. So it might be, that at a party, let's say, or in a family, it starts to conventionalize, right? To use something, or let's say prison guards, use numbers for maybe prisoners or something like that, right? So that should be more like a structural thing, not dependent on a particular lexical entry. So this should maybe show up more in an adaptation of the P600, right? So I don't know whether you could agree to that, but I think there is this difference between lexical conventionalization and more like structural. It's almost like a grammaticalization, right?
Right.
It's a new grammatical structure that develops there.
Yeah, and that's something that you could build into this continuum.
Yes.
Yeah, that there's different stages of, being lexicalized or being structural or something like that. So yeah, I would agree with that, to build this type of relation into the typology of metonymy.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt, but on behalf of those of us whose mental processes are heavily dependent on caffeine, we have to break now and continue this conversation over coffee. But before doing so, let's thank our speaker once again.